not even, on a weekly basis, not even on a monthly basis. I try not to occupy my headspace with things like that. And so it's more kind of like a systematic approach where once every 3 months or so, I'll check how things are going, and I'll sell a little bit and keep another chunk of them. And so I learned over time that I just don't have the bandwidth to do a lot of kind of like day trading or anything like that. That's not what I'm interested in. And arguably most of the things that I'm interested in are almost the opposite of looking at stock prices all the time, right? Like the companies that we invest in will have an exit in 3, 5, 10 years, 50 years even so. And so I'm training my brain to always be looking in these like very long-term outcomes. And I think that checking stock prices is detrimental to that.
Yeah, it's definitely much easier in the private market not to check in on the valuation all the time. In public markets, I learned, I invest in public companies since, let me think, since the 90s. Started with what later became ETFs, and then transitioned somewhere after 2010 in directly investing in companies. And one pick was NVIDIA, with which I'm very happy in this year. But it was really a ride from 2013-14 onwards. I was, I think, 3 times close to set it at the bottom. Everybody was right except me. Chips are a cyclical business. There is no uptake in valuation, no matter what happens in the world. And 2023 changed everything.
Yeah, well, I joined NVIDIA in 2017, and even then, the stock had, grown a little bit, but it was nowhere close to where it was today. And arguably, the pandemic changed a lot, and that there's like many reasons, but one reason is that it just became more clear after 2021 that a lot of the bets that NVIDIA had made sense. And frankly, for many years, we looked a little bit like fools in the sense of we had this cash cow, which was video games, right? And so like graphic cards being used for video games and, basically processing graphics in one way or another, like, 3D effects and stuff like that. But that was a cash cow, and so many of the resources of the company were actually going towards the getting stronger and developing more tools and libraries and platforms around AI. And so many people were asking, why are you doing this? Even the chip design at some point included kind of like machine learning capabilities embedded into the hardware itself, so it wasn't just like software, and made all these graphic cards a lot more expensive, but they didn't really have a lot of use for the core use of graphic cards at that time, which was 3D like graphic rendering in one way or another. And fast forward today, and that made so much sense. And so much credit goes to Jensen, who's the CEO and founder of NVIDIA. He's an absolute visionary, and arguably one of the people I learned the most in my career. And so that is why, to your point of if I'm keeping or selling my NVIDIA shares, I'm keeping my NVIDIA shares just because he's once in a generation type of founder, and you never want to bet against someone like that.
Oh yeah, that's true. Did you have a chance to speak directly to him while you were at NVIDIA? Cool.
Yes. Many times I, was both in meetings where I was presenting to him, or I was just participating in a kind of more passive role, but it was still small gatherings where I had the opportunity to just see how he thinks and interacts and tackles problems. And it's so unique. It's you kind of realize how much a person has, like individually a person can have a profound impact in society, right? And a lot of that I kind of transferred into my role as an early stage investor, where sure we're investing in themes and technologies and topics, but ultimately we're investing in people because they can bend reality if they are smart and strong and kind of passionate enough about what they're doing.
Yeah, this is something we need to remember, I think, very well, that business is always between people. It's from one person to another person, and not some magical entity dealing with some other magical entity. You mentioned an important part before, looking like a fool. The NVIDIA story told me one thing, that anybody who doesn't want to look like a fool shouldn't go into the investment world. I think the biggest value uptake comes from a contrarian approach, investing in things where before anybody thinks it will be the next big thing. And the downside of this habit is you always look like a fool. With your background, let me come to the first question in our conversation. I found out that you grew up in Argentina and then moved to California, and later created Psymed Ventures. Can you share a little bit more insights on your journey? What brought you from Argentina to Psymed Ventures in the end of the day?
Well, I'll try to keep it short, but to your point, I was born and raised in Argentina, and I started working for a big technology company there and got an offer to move to Silicon Valley as the kind of headquarters of the company. That's where the headquarters were located, and I was leading a part of our Latin American business out of San Mateo here in California. And what is interesting or relevant about that is that as soon as I moved here, I got exposed to the startup ecosystem, and everyone around me was in one way or another involved with technology and startups, right? Either starting a company or being early employees in a company. And I got infected with the entrepreneurial virus very, very early on. And so after a couple of years of being here in Silicon Valley, I decided to start a company myself. And that was kind of the initial point or the kernel for what I'm doing now. And so since 2013, I got involved in startups, and it's been 10 years now, and I never looked back. And so I started a company here, led the company for the first 5 years. And after I exited my position in the company, I realized, number one, how much I was still interested, and the only path for me would be to be involved with a startup or startups in general. But at the same time, I really didn't want to start another company. It's a humbling experience. It's one of, if not the most challenging experience that anyone will have as a professional in their professional business life. And so one of the options there was to become an investor. And so from an investment perspective, especially early stage investor, you're involved day to day with entrepreneurs, you're supporting them, and you're an active participant, right? It's quite the opposite of investing in the public markets, where you just buy and then don't really have much to say. Here it's quite the opposite. I always say that I actually work for the entrepreneurs that we back. And yeah, so that was the path from Argentina to technology to startup to becoming an investor. And that's how I ended up at NVIDIA, where I was supporting and investing in companies working on AI, and more specifically companies kind of building on top of NVIDIA's products and platforms, right? The path from there to Psymed is more related to my own interest. And so although I was really enjoying investing in really, really hard technical problems with AI, and that is one of the main differences with where AI is today. Today, we have this huge infrastructure, and kind of like so many pipes and picks and shovels have been laid out, so you can build, application companies on top of that. But when I started working with AI, that wasn't the case. And so a lot of what we were doing were really, really technical problems because those foundations weren't laid out. And so, although that was fascinating, my heart was very much in mental health and brain health. And so I was kind of, living a Clark Kent and Superman life a little bit, where, my 9 to 5 was doing AI stuff. And then outside of work, I was donating time and money and just knowledge to companies and nonprofits in mental health. And so in 2020, I decided to launch a fund that would actually, be focused on what's my passion, which is mental health.
That's great. You mentioned that you started a company. I did some research. I used Google Alerts today, and Google Alerts said Cook Unity. Was it this company that you? This is they closed a round recently, 47 million for food. And my question to you, with this background in food and mental health, is: do you see a connection between what people eat and their mental state?
Yeah, that's a very timely question, actually, because we are discovering so many. There's a lot of researchers and studies that are now kind of like mapping the relationship between food and mental health. And so, so number one, yes, food as medicine as an investable theme is huge. You have now companies that are kind of working on this for the treatment of cancer, and they're going through FDA clinical trials to get basically a therapeutic approved that is basically food, right? And companies like this have been backed by funds like Psymed Ventures, KDT, Cantos Ventures. These are really, really serious funds that are buying on this theme of food as medicine. One of my favorite examples of this is the ketogenic diet, right? So many of us know the ketogenic diet as something that is healthy, that people use to lose weight. But the ketogenic diet was actually invented around 100 years ago for the treatment of epilepsy. Refraction resistant. Today, there are trials, so very rigorous trials that are showing it's also extremely effective for the treatment of bipolar, schizophrenia, and depression. So that's just one example of it, right? I think that over time we'll be able to systematize and productize different diets for the treatment of different mental health disorders. So that is a topic that it's very new for us. We're still kind of exploring it, but the data are fascinating.
I always wondered, just a question before we dig into mental health and your fund. I always wondered if food is really investable. I mean, the majority of my business life since 2006 is in drug development. And it was always about patents and having a product that someone can deliver. And when I look at food, one of my passions was also doing a little bit of private research in lifestyle, especially in Eastern medicines, Eastern philosophies with martial arts. And food has tremendous value in this area. But the downside was always with food, you can't really file a patent on that. I mean, what you can do is, my opinion, extracting a part of the substance that is the most potent and try to fiddle around and make a product out of it. But when I look at the Eastern philosophies, it's not what they are talking about. They talk about an intake of several substances at the same time with nutrition. Do you see this area really as a target area of disease? I mean, someone must pay for the clinical trials, and they always wondered how investors can create a turnaround in that area.
Yeah, I agree with you that it is a different model than traditional drug development. In that sense, the IP strategy is very different, but this is not theory. There are practical examples of companies that have been extremely successful on this. And I would argue it's more on the realm of healthcare than life sciences, right? It's less biotech, more healthcare, care delivery, so to speak. One of my favorite examples is a company called Virta, VIRTA, Virta Health. And they focus on metabolic dysfunction or metabolic disorders, diabetes type 2 being kind of the biggest one there. And they have a model where basically they have three pillars. One pillar is dietary interventions, right? So like, designing a diet that's basically low carb diet, and then coaching and peer support, constant coaching. And this company goes to market through employers and also through payers, so insurance companies, and it's valued at over $2 billion today, and it has a lot of room to grow. So clearly there are ways of doing this, right? But the moat and the defensibility doesn't come from a patent.
It's good to hear that they can capture market value. 2 billion is a huge number. It's a huge number. This is great. When we talk about mental health, I mean, I'm close to 50. So when I was in my 20s, anytime when someone said, I feel sick, or the worst was a diagnosis of depression, the social environment said, suck it up. It's nothing. Go to work. Be happy. It's easy. How do you see these days in 2023 mental health, especially when we talk about the reception of society as a whole, what mental health is?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a tale of two cities, or something like that, where on one side there is lower stigma and people are more open to talking about it, and arguably the younger generations are leading the way there, where on TikTok, on Instagram and social media, and in general they're a lot more open about their struggles with mental health and the value of going to therapy, for example. So that is very promising, and I think as so many things, young folks lead the way and they move kind of like where something is on the through the Overton window, so they make it more acceptable, and that is definitely happening today. And then the other side of the story is that there's never been a higher need for mental health solutions, because more and more people are suffering with mental health disorders. We're in a society that is literally making us sick. There's a new study that just came out that says that half of the kind of world population will suffer with a mental health disorder. And mental health disorders are rapidly becoming the largest burden of disease for society. So these diseases or illnesses are more costly than cancer and cardiovascular disease and pulmonary disease and all of these things. So depends if you see the glass half empty or half full. What do you decide to take? My perspective is that on one side, I'm optimistic because we're finding better solutions and people are kind of like more open to it, but also it's not trending in the right direction. So this will require a lot of work, a lot more of, more work than what any entrepreneur or investor can do. This will require changes in policy, changes in kind of like incentives. This is a complete, housing, economic equality. This is something much bigger than the biotech sector.
Yeah, I believe that. I think it was Woody Allen who said the glass is half full, but full with poison. I think it was in the movie Scoop. You said one out of two will suffer from mental health. The number that I find with Google search is 1 out of 4. And it was Christian Angermayer in one of his posts last year who said it's basically everybody who will suffer at one point in time from a mental health crisis in their lives. How do you position your fund in this area?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, because the way I see mental health is a spectrum that goes from disease to thriving. And so obviously the DSM, the kind of like diagnostic manual for psychiatric conditions, defines what it is to have a mental health disorder, being depression, anxiety, PTSD, schizophrenia, bipolar, right? But the fact that you don't have a mental health disorder doesn't mean that you wouldn't benefit from some of the interventions that could make you live a fuller life. Because ultimately, the goal for all of us is not just to survive, right? It's not just to, be free of disease, but to thrive, to do great. And so I agree with Christian's kind of take on the fact that the addressable market is everyone, but from a coverage reimbursement perspective, where the value is and where the market is kind of like focused on disease. And so what you said, these are just statistics, or not even that, but estimations. And so it used to be 1 in 5. Then during the pandemic, that moved to 1 in 4, 1 in 3. Now they're saying that it's 1 in 2 people that will suffer from a mental health disorder. So I pay less attention to what that specific number is, and I pay more attention to like how it is trending. And unfortunately, it's not trending in the right direction. So I hope that answered your question, but maybe you kind of want to double click on something else. I feel like you asked a couple more things that maybe I didn't address.
Yeah, sure. I think anxiety, at what point would you say someone is part of the addressable market? What are the signs that people should look out? How do you define a mental health crisis for your fund?
Well, we focus on interventions that can be or will be paid by someone, right? So that is kind of like the broad definition. In a very simple or straightforward way, if you have a diagnosis of depression, anxiety, and whatnot, that is covered by insurance. And so we kind of like look for treatments that will be covered by insurance. So that is kind of the most simple one. But what we're focusing more and more today is kind of direct to consumer approaches as well. And this idea of the betterment of the people that are doing well. And so a great example of this is neurotechnology. So in neurotechnology, you have some approaches that need to be prescribed and are FDA regulated, but then you have different approaches, one being TDCS, so basically low-level electrical stimulation that doesn't require a prescription, right? And so these approaches are proven to help with ADHD, for example, but also for folks that want to improve their cognition or attention, it could be useful as well. And so arguably from an investment perspective, the bar is higher there because there's this idea of what is a painkiller and what is a vitamin. And usually common wisdom says that people will pay for painkillers, but they're less likely to pay for vitamins, right? Something that it doesn't have this acute need. And so that is a way that we also think of where we stand and what we back and what we consider something that is investable. And to your point, what is a mental health crisis is like, okay, even if something is not really considered within, a diagnosable disease, what would it take for someone to pay for it, right? And then it just varies by company. It's a little bit harder to put hard and fast rules there, but I do believe that there will be things that will be paid by consumers that are related to mental health. The best examples today of this is the meditation apps like Calm and Headspace. These are huge companies, and people are increasingly paying for them. And when I say increasingly paying for them is, number one, more people are subscribing to these apps. But what is fascinating is that these apps are increasing prices without really seeing a lot of people drop. And so the willingness to pay for mental wellness technologies is higher than what we initially thought.
Let's dig deeper in this part. You mentioned, what I liked, what you said was painkillers. So the promise of painkillers is quite simple. You have pain, it hurts, take a painkiller, and the pain is gone. So I think this is a quick fix. People understand it. You have one state, you pay, you get a drug, pain is gone. You have the outcome, the result. It's quite clear. With vitamins, you mentioned, I completely understand that it's more about longevity, and especially for 20 years old. The claim of, you may live longer. I mean, you will not die with 50, you might live to 55. It's not so tangible, the asset or the reason why they should pay. What I completely don't understand is the hype with the apps like Calm, meditation apps. When I started meditating, it was basically Zen meditation, sit down, look at the wall, breathe, and you don't need anything. Where does this hype come from, in your opinion, for meditation apps?
Yeah, we're not investors in Calm nor Headspace. We actually came online as a fund much later than when they were launched. But there is something there that we think a lot about, that it's a huge takeaway, which is so much of what we do is removing friction for things that are already available, but there's a lot of friction. And so when I think about the way that you started meditating, right, and what was the effort there, then you look at things like Calm and Headspace, and all they did is kind of, lower a little bit the friction and the effort that it took for folks to sit down and meditate, 2, 3, 4, 5 times a week. And I'm very optimistic that we're finding better technologies to remove the friction even more. There are companies today that, in this line of meditation are focused on something that's called neurofeedback. And so they're doing neurofeedback assisted meditation, where basically what they help you do is access deep meditation states more reliably and faster. Because even with Calm, and let alone, with self-guided meditation, the amount of time and the years it takes to access these kind of like deep awareness states is huge. And so what if we could help folks access states that only monks can access today in a week instead of 10 years, right? How many more people will come into this space? And so that is kind of like how I make sense of Calm Headspace, but also I just think about them as the first step in a much, much bigger ladder or kind of like staircase that will take us to expanding the market of experienced meditators.
I think it's an interesting point for LPs, especially. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, it was basically drug. And now, when I understand you right, the market opens up so much more, also on the consumer side, much more consumers are really willing to pay for solutions when the value proposition is right. Do you really think it's possible to achieve a monk-like state much easier than living somewhere in China in a remote mountain area, sitting down every day for 8 hours meditating?
I don't think so. I know that. I've seen studies where people that are meditation naive, so they've never meditated in their lives, they got a neurostimulation intervention. So through neurostimulation, a specific type of neurostimulation, they kind of like explained that the state that they had was very, very similar, if not the same, as kind of very expert meditators were able to access. So I've seen this, firsthand. I've kind of like met these people. I've read testimonies about it. So I think it can be done. The question now is, okay, how can you scale that? How can you productize it? And how you can do it in a way that is also ethical? Because this idea of bliss on demand, although it sounds very compelling, it also, it's dangerous, right? And so there are a lot of ethical questions around that. But ultimately, I think that these technologies can help alleviate suffering. In this idea of friction, I just want to mention one more example that is fascinating to me, and then we can go back to meditation and kind of like how can we do this. We talked about food, right? And this idea that something like the ketogenic diet could be very, very effective for the treatment of mental health disorders. The thing with the ketogenic diet is that it's really hard to comply or adhere to, right? There's a lot of friction. So what I'm thinking about right now is what would it look like to reduce friction there? How do we make, you know, people's lives easier when, you know, being on a strict ketogenic diet? And the beauty of what I'm saying is that there's a lot of business opportunities in just that. So anyhow, that is another example of this idea of lowering friction, and by lowering friction, getting more people with effective mental health treatments.
I mean, it's very good what you say, because so far I didn't see this vast amount of possible business models. My question always was, I know meditation works because I do it now for 3 decades, and I know that diet work, but when you can't turn it in a product, and my thinking was always product driven, so when you can't turn it in a product, it's really hard to invest in that area. And I think what you said is that in California, people are much more inventive with business models and can prove that on the market than I can bring up in my mind. What are business models in your area that you think will help LPs when they invest in funds like yours create a return after the investment?
So if I understand the question correctly, is what are these business models that are different than kind of, you know, IP defensibility from basically composition of matter?
Maybe add another thought. Most of the inventions or treatments that I see that would be possible are basically service-based. And in the environment I grew up, they always said service-based businesses are not really good investments because they cannot capture a lot market value. And you said that one company now is valued at 2 billion, which is a complete different number than not capturing any market value. My question to you is, how do the business models of the future look like in such what I call service-related businesses that help investors in funds like yours, who then invest in these models, create a return on their investment?
Yeah. Well, there are many different business models. It's impossible to kind of, you know, point one, but I'll mention a couple.
Just brainstorming.
Yeah. I'll mention a couple that come to mind from our own portfolio. One is there's defensibility and patents in neurostimulation, right? So that could be considered kind of like a medical device where there's an invention there and there's a patent around it. That could be considered, or there could be patents around the specific protocol through which you're doing the neurostimulation. So an example of this outside of our portfolio is in TMS. TMS is transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's a way of doing neurostimulation that is quite effective, very effective for the treatment of depression, at least. And it's been studied and validated for other conditions like OCD, anxiety, addiction as well. But here, you know, the device itself, it's not patentable, but what it is patentable, for example, is the specific protocol through which you're doing the stimulation. So what is the frequency, what is the amplitude, how often you do this? And there are a few really interesting companies being built around this. And another example is with brain entrainment, where basically you are synchronizing brain waves with an external stimuli. Could be light, could be sound. And so what's defensible there is the way that you're emitting that sound and light. A company that spun out of MIT called Cognito Therapeutics raised around $70 million and is in clinical trials. So it's a clinical phase company doing it for Alzheimer's. So that would be an example, right? Outside of drug development, where there's a very, very kind of like defensible business model. And then the other one, and this could be the case with some of these companies doing care delivery, is precision medicine, where there's so much value in knowing which treatment to which person at what time, right? And in order to do that, in order to like truly have a precision medicine approach, you need a lot of data. And so there, the IP, the patent is not the moat, but what is the moat is the data itself, which, you know, in so many cases, it's extremely hard to collect and have high quality data. And so when I see a company that has proprietary data that they've been collecting for a long time, and it makes sense, you know, that is not different than how Google makes money and has, you know, a huge percentage of market share. It's just data itself.
Yeah, the market, I think also the technological environment changed tremendously in the last 10 years. You mentioned sound and light. This must be sound business models for Apple, for example. I mean, they have enough devices on the market that could potentially use then this technology. Is this a too bold assumption?
Yeah. Can you repeat the question a little bit? It was hard to listen.
You mentioned before that there are technologies in development basically that can help people with emitting sound and light, to just simplify it. So these inventions must be easily implementable in devices like Apple iPhone, iPad, whatever comes out, AirPods, for example. So the technological landscape changed. Would that be something really for companies like Apple that could benefit or could help people with their devices they already use?
That's again a very timely question. The short answer is we don't know. People are exploring this or researching this. Today we don't have. So today we have, you know, preclinical and clinical studies that, you know, in mice and in humans show potential benefits of brain entrainment, right? I'm aware of, you know, studies in humans for Alzheimer's. I'm aware of preclinical studies, animal studies for depression with specific light frequencies, right? But these are using, they're not that sophisticated, but devices, but they're not iPhones. I posed this same question to some of these researchers, and the answer I got is that we don't know yet. It could be the case that you're just doing it with an iPhone or any other cell phone, and you're just using the flashlight of your iPhone, but it may not be the case, because the precision that you need for how you're emitting light, it may not be achievable with an iPhone, or maybe achievable with an iPhone that will come in 3 years from now. We just don't know that, but it's still kind of fascinating what can be achieved there, and the science around it. It's a lot more complicated than what you would think, where basically you are upregulating or downregulating things like glial cells, right? And so there's a lot that we don't know there, but it's quite promising.
But it can really turn into products. For light sound, the Apple glasses, for example, would be probably a better device than the iPhone in the future. But for LPs, it means that the technological development of these days make solutions possible that weren't investable 20 years ago, basically. So now we get all these nice gadgets that can be used as medical devices in the future. Think about running, for example. I mean, when I started marathon running 12 years ago, I had this band around my chest to measure my cardio. And now I have an Apple Watch. Basically, it's much more convenient. Which other advancements do you see in mental health that will change the way we treat these diseases?
Well, I would argue that the broader topic where we're seeing a lot of innovation is this idea of interventional psychiatry. And so basically it means that, you know, the patient is involved in the healing itself, right? Like there's an intervention in which the patient is involved and has an active participation. So a great example of interventional psychiatry is psychedelic assisted therapy. So we're seeing in the past, I would argue in the past 15 years, we've seen more and more data and clinical studies showing the potential of psychedelics for the treatment of different mental health disorders. And so in the past few years, what happened is that some of that data that was developed and created in academia has been translated into companies. And so we have an organization called MAPS, which is in phase 3 clinical trials for the treatment of PTSD using MDMA. MDMA is broadly considered a psychedelic, and so they actually just wrapped up their second kind of tier of phase 3 clinical trials, and so very soon we'll see the data. And at least in the first stage of this phase 3, the data were amazing, were extremely promising, where 67% of participants remitted. So they didn't have a diagnosis of PTSD anymore. And these were folks that, in some cases had a diagnosis of PTSD for 10, 15, 20 years. And then almost 80% of participants saw some type of improvement. You just don't see numbers like this in psychiatry anywhere. And so that is kind of like the most advanced example. You have another company that is developing psilocybin for the treatment of depression, and they are in phase 2 clinical trials as well. And so that is an extremely promising area, psychedelics for the treatment of mental health disorders. We have a number of investments in that area, both in companies doing drug development and in companies laying out the foundations and the picks and shovels, the infrastructure for psychedelic therapy to be safe and effectively delivered. The reason why it's interesting and also different than the current paradigm is that you're not just focused on hiding or treating symptoms. You're actually focused on healing people and what's called curative treatments, where what we're seeing is that folks do these treatments 1, 2, 3 times maybe, right? Like they have, in the case of MDMA, it's 3 MDMA sessions, 3 sessions with the medicine, and then you check these folks a year, 2 years later, and they're still in remission. They still don't have kind of like symptoms of PTSD. And so compare that to kind of how the standard of care is today, where folks are taking SSRIs or, broadly speaking, antidepressants forever. It's like a chronic intake to these. And there's a lot to be hopeful for. These people can live fuller, richer lives in a way.
You said 60 to 80% remission. Does that mean they can stop the therapy and taking psychedelics completely and still don't have an episode after that, after
That's
a year?
correct.
Really?
That's correct. Yeah.
I mean, it's a game changer, because what the things that I read about was it's basically a never-ending story. I mean, the alternative that we have now, it's never ending. It's just ongoing.
Yeah, that's what is so promising about it. And as I said, there is an explanation of that, right? Like, you're not just treating symptoms. It's the difference between, you have a fever, you can take ibuprofen or something like that to lower the fever. But if you have an infection, you need to treat that infection, right? To actually cure what's happening. And so that is kind of like the analogy here. People can actually, in the case of MDMA for PTSD, people can actually re-signify and explore what caused that trauma and heal through that experience, right? And so that is the main thing that can be achieved with psychedelics. But that is not. Go ahead.
There's one question that pops up in my mind. Is it already well understood by scientists why the drugs are so effective in treating not the symptoms but the root cause of the disease, or is it still a black box?
Well, somewhere in between. When I first started getting involved with psychedelic therapy, there were all these like very neat explanations of what was happening. One of them was that, for example, psychedelics were deactivating the default mode network, which is a kind of network in the brain that is commonly associated with the sense of self or the ego. And the idea was like, hey, you can lower the ego, and that helps you kind of, resurface things that are in the back of your mind, right? That have been kind of like, being held back by the ego. Today, even that common wisdom is being challenged. So I would argue that we still don't really understand a lot of this. The other kind of like common explanation for why psychedelics work is that they promote neuroplasticity. So the strengthening of the connections between different neurons and potentially neurogenesis as well. So kind of like the development of new neurons. But that doesn't really explain the totality of what's happening with psychedelics. Maybe that's kind of like more of a biological explanation. So what happens in the brain, but there's more of a psychological explanation of why having these, hallucinations, so to speak, are so therapeutic. And that's still an open question. And you have, very interesting theories, but I wouldn't dare to say that we have even a remote understanding of why psychedelics are so effective for the treatment of mental health disorders.
So much more research is needed then in this area, I guess.
Definitely more research is needed. The good thing is that FDA doesn't really ask for mechanistic explanations. They just want to make sure that something is safe and effective. And there are clinical trial, many clinical trials that are working on that. And so I think we'll have psychedelic therapies in the market way before we actually understand how they work.
You were talking about PTSD, basically. Are there also other studies ongoing or finished already in other disease areas like depression, for example, where psychedelics show that they are effective?
Yes, you name it. There you have studies in depression, anxiety, OCD, addiction. Addiction is a huge area in the realm of psychedelics. And so there's one psychedelic, it's called iboga. It's an African shrub that's been used by millennia by indigenous people in South Africa and Gabon. What is interesting about it is that it's been now explored as a treatment for opioid use disorder, and it's proven to be quite effective. There's a lot more research needed there, more studies needed, but you have that ayahuasca as well. And one of the initial studies that kind of like kickstarted this psychedelic renaissance, as they say, because the important part about psychedelics is that they have been used for millennia by different, indigenous people all over the world. We didn't discover psychedelics, right? And there's so much of wisdom that is coming from these indigenous people, and there's a lot of gratitude and rich, basically, reciprocity that we should have for folks that basically have been working with these medicines for forever. But going back to this idea of the psychedelic renaissance, one of the first studies was actually in the context of smoking cessation. So using psilocybin for folks that had a tobacco addiction. And what's interesting is that it was proven to be really, really effective. And so the potential there is very big. And one of the explanations of that is that we have all these definitions of what is depression, anxiety, addiction, but that is just our own way as humans to simplify and put things into buckets. But truly, the biology of these diseases may be a lot more common than what we like to think it is.
You can use it to cure basically the habit of smoking. I didn't know that.
Yes. So that is a big kind of research area within psychedelics. Addiction to alcohol. You have studies around alcohol addiction. There's a company that's doing this with psilocybin in Canada. They are in clinical trials right now. I think they're moving now to phase 2 clinical trials, where it's basically psilocybin for alcohol use disorder. So you have alcohol, as I mentioned, opiates, tobacco as well. So it's interesting, and again, there are many theories about why this is, but one of them comes from a Canadian physician and investigator. His name is Gabor Mate, and what he says is that a lot of these addictions actually stem from untreated or unresolved trauma. So addictions are a way to self-medicate in a way, and so that is where all these converging theories of psychedelics come to be, where sure, this is being used for addiction, but surely what's happening is that you're helping treat the underlying cause of that addiction, which is deep pain caused by trauma.
So when I understand you right, this researcher has the opinion that the root cause is a trauma from someone in the past, childhood, or if you want to go a little bit more before birth, somewhere which the family is carrying around for decades or for centuries or for generations, and it's just handed over through habits. Then you apply psychedelic therapy and you can resolve the trauma, wherever it comes from, and then the habit is gone, basically. The nasty habit of smoking or drinking, which people try probably just to cure the symptoms of the trauma, to just get over it. It's a big promise.
Exactly. My disclaimer is that is one interpretation of what's happening. I happen to mostly agree with that, but I also think that all these things are so hard to kind of simplify. Human disease is heterogeneous, right? We're all very different, and so I could see how for a big number of patients, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain, right? Where the pain is coming from. Could be intergenerational trauma, could be something else, but that may not be the case for everyone. So I'm still kind of holding some doubts about a unified theory for addiction and just like one thing that is a root cause for everyone's addiction. But I find that explanation very compelling, and it aligns with my experience with many people that I met in my life, where as they uncovered why they had the addiction and what was the underlying trauma, and they worked on healing, they got rid of that addiction.
Yeah, I mean, first people must see that they have a problem, and then they can cure it and change it. And when I look at smoking, the difficult thing is that as long as people don't perceive it as a problem, there is no reason to change it. But when they come to the point that they say, okay, smoking is a problem now in my life and I want to change it, then they really quickly run into a wall and realize it's not easy. It's not easy getting off smoking, especially when their entire social cycle revolves around smoking and everybody smokes. Getting out of that. And what I understood from your explanation is that psychedelic therapy has the potential to be a quick game changer. So you surface the trauma, you solve it, and then you are free from the addiction. When that is really true, I mean, there is a lot of behavior that people perceive as limiting in their lives and would want to change it. Do you see an extended use cases for psychedelic drugs, basically to change also other nasty habits when people realize there is something going on and I want to change it, that they can not only treat diseases, but also any limiting belief, any limitations in their lives when it's rooted in when it's coming from a similar problem like depression?
Yes, absolutely. This goes back to the start of our conversation and this idea that the market, the addressable market is everyone, because all of us are in one way or another struggling with something in our lives and something that we'd like to do better or alleviate suffering. And so an author called Michael Pollan calls this the betterment of the people that are doing well, right? And so psychedelics um, hold a lot of promise there, and arguably thousands of people every weekend are doing psychedelic journeys that, you know, are aimed towards resolving some issues in their lives without really, this being considered a mental illness. So absolutely. What is worth noting there is that how psychedelics can legally come to market. And so you have different pathways to, for psychedelics going to market: decriminalization, kind of adult use or supervised use. And there's a couple states in the US where this is being done, where it's not going through FDA, but still it's kind of regulated in one way or another. It's not similar to cannabis, but the framework of thinking how something can legally be accessed without FDA kind of approval, in that sense, there's a similar framework. Where we as Psymed are focused on is on the medical market. And so in that sense, psychedelics will be prescribed for folks that have a diagnosis of depression, PTSD, or any other mental health disorder. And so there, the playbook is a lot more aligned with things that you, Christian, are used to, which is run preclinical, studies, and then go to phase 1, 2, 3, and eventually, submit data to the FDA saying, hey, it looks like this therapeutic, this drug, and I'll kind of explain why I'm say therapy and therapeutic there, why this therapeutic is safe and effective. Once that's done, then payers define how is this reimbursed or covered by their different plans, and folks can get these therapies prescribed. And so that is where we're focused on, and there are many reasons why we're focused on that, but one of the reasons is that we think that that will be the fastest and the best way for many folks that couldn't access these medicines or these treatments by just paying out of pocket will be able to, right? Ultimately, folks that are in, the VA, so the veterans kind of healthcare system here in the US, or Medicare, Medicaid, folks with, very low incomes, or seniors over 65 will get this covered almost with no out-of-pocket expenses. What is relevant and important to know for folks that are not experienced in this topic of psychedelic therapy is that this is called psychedelic assisted therapy. And the reason of that is that this is not a magic pill. This is not easy at all. It's not you just take a drug and you're cured. This is a much more involved, painful process where not only the patient needs to go through this journey 1, 2, 3 times, but also it requires a highly trained person, which could be an MD, a physician, or someone else that can guide the person through this process. This process can be really, really challenging. And so ultimately what we are investing in as a fund in the context of psychedelics is psychedelic assisted therapy. It's something much wider and bigger than just a pill.
So there are a lot of, we would say, obstacles that needs to be, where you have to work to get it out of the way. I mean, one is, I think, the public perception of psychedelics. When I look at here in Austria, I think it's somewhere close to cocaine or illegal drugs. This is one thing. The other thing is that it still means working through trauma. So when you say clinical trials, they can prove that it's effective. It means the patient has to undergo psychological, deep psychotherapeutic work with a specialist. So it's not you just pop a pill and the problem is solved. So it's hard work. Is this the right understanding?
That's right. Yeah, it's hard work. It's not just popping a pill. So it's a very different paradigm. Arguably a more expensive paradigm, right? Taking an SSRI every day, it's very affordable, but that's not really curing anything for many folks. And so that is an interesting kind of question that the field is still going through, which is this kind of a cost-effective treatment, and how do you stack this versus kind of the standard of care? And we're still kind of like answering those questions, but there are some studies that show that if this is as effective as it's shown to be in clinical trials, although the upfront cost will be more expensive because you're paying for the therapist's time and everything like that, then ultimately the societal cost is lower because you don't have absenteeism. These people don't have other health complications 5-7 years down the line. And so those are kind of like the exciting questions that we're still answering. And again, once we have all the answers to those questions, this will not be a venture investable field anymore. The whole point of venture is that you invest when there's still open questions.
When people still think you're a fool because you invest in this area. I mean, to build on what you said, I can imagine that, we need a lot more psychotherapists. Basically, it's already limiting factor here in Europe that we have not enough. Here in Austria, I think it takes a year or so until someone gets an empty spot when it's covered by social insurance and not paid with their own money. And the second thing is that you mentioned that basically it's not an easy way, but at the end of the day, it's a lifetime people get their life back. So basically, depression is just the hard things. Depression leads to procrastination, not being effective on the workplace, or not working at all. So when young people have a trauma from their childhood, it means they still are part of society for decades, but not really productive. Did you do any studies on that? What that means then for society? How much productivity comes back?
Yeah, there are many studies that show that folks that are experiencing depression, for example, from a societal cost, obviously, as you mentioned, absenteeism, loss in productivity, but also there's a huge correlation between depression and poor physical health, right? And this is bi-directional, right? Like having a poor physical health could lead to depression, but also in many cases, folks that have depression down the line have a lot more physical health complications, and they need to go back to the healthcare system to treat that. And so yes, there's many studies that show this, not so much in the context of psychedelics, but this is a lot. This is older than psychedelics, and this correlation is very well characterized.
When you don't get a psychotherapist here in Austria, people treat their depression mostly with alcohol. So this then results in poor health, which drives them further down the road, and they're not productive at all at the end of the day. So they're basically have other health issues further down the road. I did some work with professors at UCL, and when you have them then in their 40s and 50s, they have problems with the liver failure, and it becomes really expensive. And when psychedelics can treat it, when the first symptoms set on, and we have the necessary resources of psychotherapists who can help people, I think it's a promising route to go.
Yeah, and also, to your comment on the lack of trained therapists or psychotherapists, I would say the difference is that a lot of the therapist work in psychedelics happens upfront. So let's say someone needs to go through roughly 30 hours of psychotherapy, including maybe like 40 hours, including the the psychedelic sessions and the in-between sessions, let's just say it's 40 hours. So those are a lot of hours, but compare that to someone that is in, therapy for 3 years, and just assuming they go to therapy once a week, that's 150 hours. So that is where the equation starts to make a lot more sense, right? And where potentially, psychedelics can actually alleviate that lack of supply, right? Like lack of enough workforce when it comes to therapists. I think like the model of going to therapy once a week, it's just not scalable, and we will never be able to catch up with the demand. And so we need to be more creative in terms of how we deal with this. And so, as I mentioned, psychedelics is an example of this. Group therapy in the context of psychedelics, even more, and going full circle, even AI. We have a few investments that are leveraging AI to augment the therapist work, where they're not out of the loop, right? These are not autonomous AI agents that are treating folks, but they're augmenting the therapist's work. So in a way, one therapist could do the work that used to be done by 3-4 therapists.
Would you imagine a world in the future where you combine psychedelics with artificial intelligence in a way that people can self-medicate at home without a therapist?
In theory, yes. In practice, I think this is, very, very far down the road, and it's not something that it's even close to happening. I think specifically with psychedelics, we're so focused on safety that's just not really a priority. The priority right now is to get these medicines in the market, get this, show that they are safe and effective, and start building from there. So from a mental health perspective, I'm not really that bullish on these, completely independent, autonomous solutions yet. It may, happen in the future. What I'm a lot more bullish on today is using AI to augment the practitioner's work in one way or another. It could be the back office work, it could be the front office, could be doing sessions. There's a lot of different ways that this can be done, obviously in drug development as well. But we're not really focused on kind of removing the human out of the loop.
I don't think it's possible. Humans like being treated by humans, I guess. So I have some physicians who say that they have a better outcome when they spend more time with the patients. And as you mentioned, they very often complain that they have too much administrative work to do, which limits the time on the patient. So I think this is the big promise of artificial intelligence, probably, to give them more time for patients and make the patient-physician interaction much more productive.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is what we're betting on from a care delivery perspective.
When some LPs are listening or some startups are listening, can you outline 1 or 2 of your investments so that people understand your sweet spot, what you actually then see as an investable target?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so let me just say that, as you mentioned, mental health is a huge issue. And so one of the main things that sometimes when we run into new LPs, what this is like, this sounds too small. This is a niche. And I go back to what we discussed at the beginning. Mental health is the largest indication in healthcare. And healthcare in many countries, especially in the US, is the largest budget item in the GDP, right? And so this is the largest item in healthcare, which is the largest item in America's GDP. And so there's no lack of investable opportunities here. There's a lot of things, but to your question of interesting companies that I could name, one company that we started or we got involved very early on, it's called Journey Clinical. It's a company based out of New York. And the way that I like to explain what they do is that they empower independent psychotherapists to safely and effectively offer psychedelic assisted therapy. So what's the kind of like pain point here? Psychotherapists are a much larger population, much larger group than psychiatrists, right? But psychotherapists cannot prescribe any drugs. And so they're in this difficult position where they would like to work with psychedelics, but they just cannot prescribe it to patients. And so what Journey does is that they come in as the, default physician and MD and partner with the patient and the psychotherapist. So they create this like three-way relationship where the patient can safely and effectively offer or access psychedelics, right? And so this is expanding the market size and the folks that can access and can offer psychedelics tremendously by 100x actually. So in that sense, it's a really interesting company. We back them at their pre-seed and seed and then Series A as well. And they recently raised a round from a fund that's called Union Square Ventures. It's a fund that also invested in companies like Twitter and Coinbase and many other decacorns. And so what to me is fascinating about this is that psychedelics used to be more of a French thing. And today, even the most successful, experienced, established funds in Silicon Valley or in the US, because this fund is based in New York, are actually investing in some of these companies. Another example of a company that we like a lot, it's called Motif, M-O-T-I-F. And this company is in the field of neurostimulation. I did mention something, a technique called TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. So TMS is also a different paradigm. Similarly to psychedelics, is a very different paradigm of treating patients, where instead of focusing on a drug and kind of like taking something that's hidden the symptoms, by doing neurostimulation, you're retraining your brain and brain circuits and different brain regions to kind of communicate in a different way. So it's a more passive kind of like learning than psychedelics, but still what it truly is this idea of retraining your brain and establishing some connections in a way that wasn't happening before. So again, this is a lot more focused on treating the root cause of some disease instead of the symptoms. And so what Motif does is that they take this idea of TMS, that you need to do it in the clinic, and they bring it to the home. So folks can get an intervention at home, 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, and that's all it takes to remit from things like treatment-resistant depression. So a really interesting company. It's spun out of Rice University in Texas, and it's also a good example of many of our portfolio companies. Over half of our portfolio companies are academic spinouts. So although some of the things that we're investing in may sound very kind of out there, most of them are truly and deeply grounded in deep, rigorous science.
Do you invest outside the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. We did invest in companies that are based in the UK and Germany. This was prior to the current fund. So in our current fund, we have companies that are based in Australia, and then all the other ones are based in the US. But prior to this fund, we made investments in companies based in Germany and the UK, and we're open to investments anywhere in the world. What I'll say is that we usually invest in very much cutting edge technologies. And so we're not kind of married to only investing in the US, but it just happens that a lot of the innovation, it's happening in the US. I hope more universities and more funding goes to doing research in these areas outside the US. That would be ideal for me.
how we have great innovations in Europe, but actually a lack of investment capital. So this might be a call to action for some listeners. I work now with scientific founders for over 17 years. And I think there are some ideas in the pipeline that might be interesting for your fund. Transition from academia to startup. I'm curious to hear your opinion. Here in Europe, very often when I negotiate licensing deals, or when tech transfer offices approach me, they have ideas of a lot of equity, high upfront payments. And I recently had the Venture Connect initiative on my podcast from the CERN Institute, and they put out a model where they basically want to have 2% royalties when some capital, when some revenue-based cash flow streams come into the company. What are deal terms that you see in the United States when it comes to out-licensing patents and inventions from academia into startups?
I mean, terms vary a lot. It depends on which institution is leading this. Some universities have this process very streamlined. Stanford, I would argue, is the best example of this, where they incentivize their professors in one way or another to kind of like, out license or spin out companies. And so they have kind of like they have reduced a lot of the friction there. And so it could look like a 2% income revenue share. So like just getting, the university getting 2% of revenue. It could look like a few points of participation in the cap table, so ownership in the company, and there are a lot of other creative, like milestone-based approaches. I think what looking at our portfolio companies and the most successful cases have been when the professor that developed that invention, right, like owns that invention, or kind of like, it was their lab, the one that did it, is the one that is actually starting the company. That negotiation process is a lot easier than if the professor is like, you know what, I'm not getting involved with the company, I just want to out-license something, and I'm putting it in the hands of the TTO, the technology transfer office. There, the negotiations are a lot more complicated, but that is not the case with our portfolio companies, where companies like Delix, Motif, Freedom Biosciences, all these companies, basically the inventor is the one that is either the CEO of the company or the CSO, Chief Science Officer of the company. And so when it's like that, the TTO doesn't put that big of a fight in terms of terms, because they would need to be conflicting not with like some stranger lawyer, entrepreneur. They're conflicting with their own kind of colleague who's also a member of that university. So that is the model that we like, and that's a model that we usually back when the professor is
I think we have a freeze. I think now you're back. The screen was frozen.
I lost you for a second. I'm trying to move to a place where there may be more signal. I think this may be better.
So you're currently in California. I think it's still pretty amazing that we can have a phone call between Europe, Vienna, Austria, and California, which is almost uninterrupted. You got frozen by the model you prefer when the professor is, and then the screen froze. Maybe we can pick it up from there.
Absolutely. So in a few words, the model we prefer is where the professor is deeply involved with the company, ideally full-time. The best experiences we've had is when the professor is actually leaving academia altogether, or taking a leave of absence. A few examples of these are a company called Alto Neuroscience, which is developing precision medicine drugs for the treatment of mental health disorders. The professor there is Ahmet Erkin. He was a tenured professor at Stanford, and he left to lead Alto. And that just speaks to how much he believes in the company, right? And so that is an example of it. I mentioned Motif as well, where Professor Jacob Robinson out of Rice University took a leave of absence to start Motif. And so these highly technical, passionate professors that are taking a leap of faith and taking a lot of risk, which is not that common in academia, towards moving to a startup, those are the models that tend to work best.
That's good to know. Matias, I love talking to you, and you have a lot of valuable information to share, and I could ask you much, much more questions, and would mean we would talk another 2 hours or 3 hours. And I remember that you would like to jump to your next meeting in 5 minutes. How would you want to spend the last 5 minutes? What is the question I should ask you?
What is the question you should ask me? Well, let me move, pass the microphone back to you. I would love to hear from your side why mental health is relevant for you, why, for your listeners, and maybe kind of what are some takeaways that you got from this, and maybe like things that kind of ignited in your own imagination around this, and maybe that's kind of like a way for us to discuss future engagements between you and I.
I think mental health is one of these areas that needs still a bit of groundwork here in Europe. It's mostly neglected, in my opinion. So when I walk around here in Vienna and talk to people, without being a professional in that area, but from the basic knowledge I have, I say, okay, psychotherapy or going to a psychiatrist might help, but people are not aware of that yet. The limiting factor that I see then here in Europe is when all those people come to a point in their life that something is going on that would be worth treating, which is getting better and better and better every year, in my opinion. We have the bottleneck that you mentioned before, not enough personnel. So one thing that we need to solve is having enough psychotherapists, psychiatrists, finding artificial intelligence solutions and better treatments. How much people really need support? I think 1 in 4 is a good number to not scare people away. Like Christian Angermayer puts it, basically everybody is nuts, is probably a bit scary, because then people get anxious and say, no, I'm not, I'm one of those. But actually, as you said, I liked the way you put it. We're talking about quality of life, basically. We're not talking about crazy people. We're not talking about these severe cases where people are a danger for themselves or a danger for society. We talk about improving people's life, the quality of their lives. And I think the solutions that you mentioned will bring a lot of value to our society as a whole in future. And the connections that we can have between us, since you are also interested to invest here in Europe and not only in the United States, I think Europe is a treasure trove of innovations. And I'm sure that one or the other listener who's thinking about finding investors for their innovation will most likely reach out to you. I know a lot of CTOs and scientific founders who are operating in the area that you mentioned. And this is my call to action to them. Just pick up the phone, go to LinkedIn, reach out to Matias, and probably there is an investable object at one point in time.
Absolutely. And I can attest to the potential of Europe in where you are in Austria. The IST, Institute of Science and Technology, is an amazing place where there's really interesting innovation. And even some of the studies that I referred to today came out of IST.
Oh, you know them already?
Oh yeah, I know them quite well, and they're TTO, and they also have a fund that is very very interesting how they're supporting companies in Europe, and we want to partner with them as well.
Now they're doing an amazing job. IST is such a blessing for Europe. I think this was 12 years ago, one of the best moves of the Republic of Austria to start this institution. And Alexander Schwarz, Markus Wanko, they're doing such a great job.
Yes, I agree. I agree. Christian, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. I look forward to our next conversation.
Me too. Let's stay in touch and enjoy your day in California.
Have a good one.
See you soon. Bye-bye.